for those of you that, well, I didn't add
You did.
all the options, all the donut spelling options. So for those of you that caught that, let me know if it marked you wrong for spelling donut with a U-G-H. Let me know and I'll fix that. But yeah, just want to be on the record that I tried to fix that. All right. I'm sorry for that. This is great. We did hear from Jerry's assistant just a few moments ago that he would be jumping on a little bit later. So we'll see him when he sees him. Tanny, if you can get into a place where the light is on, that would be great. Oh, there he is. Great. Well, good morning, Jerry. We're just all logging in and getting situated. So
good morning,
glad you're here.
Professor Bartlett. Glad to be here.
Yeah,
So
sure, please.
Call.
Yes, I'm glad you made it. Great. We are, yeah, glad to see everybody. I hope, at least for all of us in Kansas, you're not getting blown away too hard with the winds that are going crazy today. So yeah, hopefully you're all right. Well, good. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's a little after 10. I'm sure there'll be a couple more. Well, we're close to our maximum group of people, but yeah, there may be a couple more jumping in. So good morning, welcome. I'm excited that today we get to talk about this book that you've all read and are writing and have written a book review on. So, and Jerry, thank you for being with us. It's really great to have you here. We didn't, go into a ton of detail on how we want to flow. Stacy and I are really chilled and we can adjust and adapt. But one thing I want to do as we begin, and we mentioned this in class, you should have your question, everybody. And so either type it now or maybe you're copying and pasting it and dropping it into the chat. Want to have all those questions, and then Stacy and I can sort them as Jerry shares a bit, and then we can pull out some of those questions. So ready, go, drop your question in the chat.
While we wait for them, Jerry, where are you at right now?
I live in southwestern Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area.
Great. Were you sad that our team beat your Steelers?
No, I've ever since the tax-funded stadium here in Pittsburgh, I've emotionally detached from the fortunes of the team. Ironically, since I helped pay for it every time I bought something, paying the sales tax. So I don't follow the ups and downs. So actually, I had an article in the Wall Street Journal, was 13 years ago now, where I talked about the sports economics and the Steelers, because people were talking about how the stadium's great and there's Steeler bars all over the country, and there aren't any Seahawk bars around the rest of the country, so that's really great for us. And I said, well, wait a minute, there's Steeler bars all over the country because there are Pittsburghers who've been driven away by poor economic performance. So yeah, the Seahawk bars are there, they're in Seattle, because they're growing. So I kind of have, sports can obviously be a source of excellence, but what I've noticed, the kind of the Rust Belt story, is that where there has been failure to really establish a flourishing economy, the victories of the team are a substitute for real victory. And I think that's a lot of, this is being recorded. I'm going to get killed
No,
here.
you're fine. You're fine.
This is only for the couple students who can't come today, so you're good.
Yeah,
You're
right.
fine.
So I'll get excited about winning teams when there's winning economies producing winning teams that don't need subsidies.
Yes. Well, I know that the Chiefs Stadium is not paid for, it's private. So, yes, actually, we look at that case study in our financial management class about what happens when you tax to build things like entertainment districts. And anyway, that's interesting.
Right. Inner Harbor, Boston, Cleveland has a lot of the cities have this, and it's designed to reverse a decline.
Mhm.
But that's not what it does. In some ways, it accelerates a decline, because people will say, well, you spend a lot of money at the aquarium, or you spend a lot of time at the, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, or you spend a lot of time, at the stadium, and you're spending money there, but you're simply redirecting away from other entertainment venues. So every overly expensive, sports bar with designer beers that's next door to the stadium is some local pub or bar you don't go to, right? So it doesn't create new economic activity. It redistributes it away from the region that pays for these things towards a certain point. And I think this is kind of an example. I think it actually fits kind of well with, what we're talking about, which is that this kind of intermarriage between private business and taxation and government spending and monopoly, right? Because these franchises are monopolies, is, I think, the kind of distortion of the market economy that we saw sort of in a different form, in the first century. But it's still the same basic idea, which is give me power, give me money, and it will be good for you. It'll get to you somehow, but it mostly doesn't, right? It's mostly a cronyist economic system. And that's almost the default state of mankind. As long as when you get past a village, right, and you actually get to something as big as a city, or a nation, when you get that kind of scale, almost all ancient economics defaults to people who have access and power, and modern economics, really, people who have access to money and power, and then use it for their own benefits. Sometimes the rhetoric is a social justice rhetoric, which is we're going to redistribute it we're going to redistribute downwards. But they say redistribute downwards, but they don't. They redistribute upwards while talking about downward redistribution. And I think that's essentially that's the economics that we see, with Judas Iscariot, who centralizes the poor tithe. He centralizes the poor offering, shames Jesus for accepting an expensive gift because it could have been given to the poor, which means it wouldn't have been given to the poor. It would have been given to the common purse where he would have stolen it. So, and I think, and if you've read the book, you see this, I think that's not just the story of Judas, that's the story of Judea, after whom he's named, or they're both named after, I mean, there's a commonality of name. It's Judas Maccabeus. That's the story of that economy where they had changed Torah in such a way as to take the poor tithe. So there was a requirement to tithe and share it with the poor in the village. And there was a legal revolution, even though these people talked about tradition, they were always revolutionizing the actual Torah. If you're creating new traditions, they're not actually traditions, they're new, right? And one of them was send the tithe money here and we'll take care of the poor. But they didn't, they took care of themselves, which is why when you see Jesus going in the temple vicinity, you see all these poor people around. Why are there all these poor people around who are still poor? The temple was supposed to be taking care of this because the high priest was supposed to be distributing the poor tithe. Send it to us, send the money to us, and we'll share it with the poor on your behalf. And we're smart, and we know how to do it right. And Judas is essentially trying to turn the Jesus movement into the same thing. He's got an economic model, which he learned from the Judean elite, which he's performing himself. And basically, that the whole message of the book is to let the Gospels kind of speak for themselves and read these details carefully. And since you've read it, and written a report on it. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail. It's just that the 100% correlation pattern is that all confrontations that Jesus has over wealth are in geographical proximity to the capital region, Jerusalem, and the temple, especially the temple elite. None in Galilee, which had wealthy people, but was not a cronyist system for the most part, was instead a decentralized small business network system. So all of the confrontations take place geographically in Judea, close to the temple, and they all take place in social proximity to the ruling elite, whether it's the Pharisee ruling elite or whether it's the Sadducee ruling elite. So it's people who have access to power, the rich young rulers, Zacchaeus, the head tax collector, the money changers. So I think the mistake has been for people who want to create a socialist Jesus is to take Jesus's comments about money and universalize to all wealthy people when he conspicuously only uses that rhetoric in specific cases. Or the conservative tendency is essentially, Jesus isn't really talking about money. He's not really talking about economics. He's just talking about greed and our heart. And if our heart attitude is right towards money, then he's not saying anything about me. And Jesus confronts the rich young ruler because he saw into his heart and knew that he was greedy. So the evangelical tendency is to reduce everything down to a heart issue, no social dimension whatsoever. You ask Jesus into your heart, right? And that's it, right? As opposed to then you act like Jesus in the world and you get your heart right about money, but nothing changes. Just your attitude about it changes and nothing socially changes. And so the conservative tendency has been to sort of like what I would say is turn down the volume on Jesus. So the conservative conversation is mostly, well, he doesn't mean this, and he doesn't say the state, and he really, or that's after the second coming that matters, And I don't think either of those are the right answer. The left kind of half listens to Jesus and sounds a little socialist. He must be a socialist. And the right tries to turn the volume down. Oh, he's not talking about the economy. Jesus never says anything about the economy, just personal salvation, when he's clearly talking about the economy a lot. And we have to artificially limit Jesus's topics. It's like we're saying to Jesus, you're allowed to talk about this, personal salvation, second coming, afterlife, how to manage a church. No other, all other topics are off limits for you, Lord. And if you let him speak, he is, as a prophet, denouncing injustice. Prophets do that. He's not less than the prophets of old. He's more than the prophets of old. And so then what you do, you get a Jesus who is confronting a very specific thing, the use of power and manipulation to extract wealth from people who are creators of it to people who are takers of wealth. And the takers are people who have the power to take. So in a nutshell, that's the book, and that economic system is still with us now. And it can call itself all sorts of different things. It almost doesn't matter what it calls itself. What matters is what it does. And if it centralizes power and uses that to redistribute money to the center, whether it talks about helping the poor or it says, I don't care about the poor, whatever the rhetoric is, the reality is that when you give people that much power, they're going to use it that way. And I guess, finally, the argument is that early on in the Gospels, we have Jesus having all sorts of confrontations and debates over theological questions. But he doesn't get killed over the theological questions. They don't set out to kill Jesus until he tells a parable which clearly reveals their economic exploitation. In Luke's gospel, it says that they discerned that he was talking about them and set out to destroy him. So they got mad when he messed with their theology, but they murdered him when he messed with their money. And I think that still is a reality. And there's a certain tendency for we conservative Christians, and I am, to get really like everything's about theological stuff. And it's almost like the powers that be would say, do theology all you want. That's all right. Just that doesn't argue about all that stuff all you want. Just do not mess with the money. Do not mess with our system. I mean, because that's what Caiaphas said. We will lose our nation and our place, our position. We'll lose our economic status. And one man must die that, so that the nation can be saved. And I don't think that human dynamic has changed. And let me just, kind of end on this, which is, if somebody thinks that it's different now, I would say, well, why would it be better now? That was Jerusalem. They had the law, they had the prophets. Everybody there had been bar mitzvahed. They memorized large portions of the Torah. They were immersed in biblical wisdom and knowledge. So they were much more biblically informed than we were. And they had the witness of Jesus himself, the second person incarnate. And with all those advantages, they utterly abused their power. So tell me why in 21st century America or developed Europe or whatever, why we that have cut ourselves off largely, where our elites have cut ourselves off from the Bible as a source for wisdom, why we're somehow going to be better at handling power than the leaders of the nation that had the greatest religion of the ancient world were. Yeah, just explain to me why we're going to get it right when those people who had so many other advantages got it wrong. So, I think probably I've said enough, unless you don't think I have, and happy to take questions and comments.
No, thank you. Go ahead, Stacy.
No, I was just saying, yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. I liked that you brought in how maybe a more conservative bent is also not getting it right, because I think that's important to show the both sides. But yeah, we could move into questions. Rick, I'll let you lead.
Yeah, I've actually pulled some out and I've stuck them onto a Word document. So so I guess, Jerry, a couple of questions. I'm trying to kind of put them in some kind of sequence. I guess one question, this kind of is a personal one that was asked in the chat. What caused you to initially reject your Marxist ideals? And then what was the reaction of your peers as you pursued Christian views?
I rejected Marxism on the basis of philosophical problems with atheist materialism. In other words, it really comes down to a theory of knowledge. And the whole world of what one might call critical theory or the hermeneutics of suspicion or deconstruction, and these have now become like hot wars among evangelicals, which I think is unfortunately, I don't want to pounce on someone because they use a word. Paul actually tells Timothy, don't do that. Don't debate over words, debate over ideas. Okay, but the ideas were, what I was exposed to essentially as a teenager by my grandfather, who was a socialist, was the idea that you got to question authority. You've got to question the existence of God. You've got to question the capitalist system. You've got to question, democracy as it's now constituted. You got to question the authority of parents, the authority of the church, et cetera. And so I did that and found that those institutions didn't really have good answers. I had a very, I would say, not biblically grounded Methodist minister that I was loosely associated with the church. And I said, I don't believe in God anymore. Why should I? And he said, well, your mom believes in God, right? And, yeah, your dad believes in God. Yeah, I think so. Well, then why don't you? Well, it's not, it's not hereditary. I mean, I want a reason to believe it. So, a church doesn't really deal with answering those questions. So the hermeneutics of suspicion is always saying, why should I believe you? The big breakthrough for me was when you turn that around on Marx or Freud or Darwin, any of these people who are essentially deconstructing the Christian civilization, saying, why should you believe them? Well, good question. Why should I believe you? Like Marx, you say, well, there's no philosophy, there are no real ideals. It's all just economic interest. Whenever somebody says something about philosophy, all they're doing is that's all just a cover for their economic interests. It's like, okay, how about you, Carl? When you do philosophy, is that a cover for economic interest? Or when Darwin says everything that we call consciousness and mind is really just instinct because we're all just animals. It's like, okay, Chuck, how about you? Aren't you just speaking out of instinct? Aren't all you critical theorists sawing off a limb of a tree that you're sitting on, which is the reliability of reason. So that was the breaking point for me. Once you turn their hermeneutics of suspicion on themselves, all they can do is abuse. You're just speaking for the patriarchy or the whatever, and so they don't have answers. What I came to the conclusion is the only possible answer is a God of revelation. That whenever anybody says something, you can always say, "Why should I believe you?" And ultimately, they can't give a reason. In the end, they're just making an assertion. They might have a reason, but then that reason, why should I believe that reason? So it becomes an infinite regress, turtles all the way down. Eventually, they say, that's just what I believe, right? But you're finite. How could you know? If you don't have an infinite God who tells you that to get you started with the process of thinking, to stand on, then all philosophical systems fall apart. So that was my shift. Now, when I shifted away from Marxism, the socialism just naturally went away too. They were clearly intertwined with one another. That might be more, I know this isn't a philosophy class, so that might have been a little bit more epistemology than business class at 10 a.m. wanted, but that's
great.
That's the answer.
No, thank you. And that's a student question. So somebody was wanting that kind of a depth and answer. I think a similar one, and I saw it a few times. We're a Christian college, but not everybody has to sign on the dotted line when they come. So a couple people said, what can a non-Christian or someone new to Christianity take away from your book?
I think everybody should get to know Jesus. I can't think of a reasonable reason why any human being on planet Earth should not get to know somebody who is so influential that we name the years after him. And not just here. Jerusalem Post says it's 2022. So does People's Daily, China. So he's clearly an incredibly important historical figure. And he makes some pretty strong claims for himself. And he has 1.5 and growing followers. And pretty much anyone who's taking part in this conversation lives in a civilization that is to some degree based on his ideas. I think what's going on right now, Zoom, the kind of decentralized network system that we've developed here largely in America, is unthinkable without Jesus taking his Galilean attitude of decentralization and distribution, what we might call democratization, but I don't think that captures it. Distribution, pulling power down and pushing it out. That came in a place like this, rather than in a place like Beijing or Istanbul, for a reason. So everyone, I don't see why anyone wouldn't want to get to know him. And this, I think, when you read about him as someone who's talking about economics and business and marketplace, which is where we mostly spend most of our time. We don't mostly live in church. We mostly live in a marketplace. Why would you not want to get to know him, specifically him speaking about the kinds of things that we all spend most of our time in? So get to know him, then decide about him.
That's great. Thank you. That's brilliant. Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. Another question, kind of zooming out a little bit, how do you approach a conversation about economics, finance, and church, particularly the themes of your book, with someone who you know is going to be standoff about the topic?
I don't. I'm an economist, which means I allocate resources where I think, Jean-Baptiste Say, inventor, discoverer of Say's law, says an entrepreneur is someone who takes resources from a situation of low yield and moves them to a situation of high yield. So I don't really spend time, trying to talk to people who I know can't even hear it, right? And so if somebody has very strong ideological commitments, and that could even be on the conservative side, because a lot of the resistance to this isn't from the left, it's from the right. They put Jesus in a box and Jesus is coming out of the box, and that makes them nervous. And also what I find is when I first started talking about some of these ideas with academic theologians, there was almost a sense, and I talk about this in the book, like it's competing with their theological discussion. Like if you say Jesus is mad at these religious leaders because they're economically exploiting people, they're saying, no, he's mad at them because of their false teaching, right? Like works righteousness, etc. And why would you think that he couldn't be angry about both? In fact, why would you not see that those things go really well together? False teaching and economic exploitation are best friends, right? If I can convince you that you can't talk to God except through me, and you can't get your sins forgiven except through me, it's not long before I'm going to ask you for your credit card number, and try to pick your pocket. And if not me, let's say that I'm of unusual, character. I don't know what I would, if I was a Sadducee in the first century, I don't know whether I would have been a good guy or not. But let's say I was. So at some point, the system is going to bring the worst people in, and they're going to economically exploit. So I find that people who've made their living just talking a certain way about things, they just can't hear. But here's the thing. That's a pretty narrow group that's kind of dominated the conversation. There's always been a Christian conversation that's like centered in the clergy and in doctrinal disputes, but there's always been this much broader conversation among just Christians. And a lot of it is about how do you live? How do you act? How do you act in the marketplace? How do you act in the world? And what I find is in those zones, this is very much accepted. So that's where I go.
That's great. And just as a frame for this next question, it was actually something I thought of too. So not everyone in this meeting, of course, but our school comes from the Anabaptist tradition. And so here's a student question that sort of frames that in a way I think approaches that. How do you approach a conversation? Oh, sorry, I was reading the wrong question. How can we as Christians look for and try to achieve positive change in economic and political issues, since we should not be in positions of power in the state? I mean, that would be a Amish kind of answer. Yeah. Anyway, that would be a real one side. Some would say, no, you can still be involved. But yeah, how do we have those conversations if we're seeking to sort of be Christ against culture in that sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, that can work. It wouldn't be where I'm coming from, although I'd heed the warning very carefully. Just making my own personal observations, what I've seen in American politics lately is a situation in which Christians became politically engaged, but it's not entirely clear who's discipling whom. It's not clear whether Christians are discipling the political marketplace or whether the political marketplace is discipling the Christians. And so the Anabaptist warning, whether you come to the same conclusion or not. And the way I tend to look at these different traditions is not so much this one's right, this one's wrong, but more like the Holy Spirit is saying something to the church through this group, and the Holy Spirit is saying something to the church through this group. And maybe this group over here has taken that and maybe taken it further, than the truth, because that's what almost always happens. Like there's a true thing, and then there's a real strong tendency to cluster around that true thing and then push it, to maybe beyond its logical conclusion. So what I would say is this is a great moment for Anabaptists to come forward, and if they can avoid the "I told you so," to come forward and say, listen, this is a warning in Scripture about playing footsie with power, and that we're not telling you necessarily that you can't be involved in politics or can't work for the state. That's something that the church does not have consensus on. But the warnings about having that power are strong. And yet someone who is aware of the Anabaptist warnings would have been more on guard over the past several years about essentially the Christian witness being almost completely subsumed under, say, civil religion, nationalism, and political personality cults. So I think Anabaptist theology can help us there. There's also an issue of, if someone is a member of the state, well, part of the question is what kind of state, right? Because if it's a minimal state with minimal power, if it's a foot washing state, if it's, if it's organized like Jesus, well, it's one thing to be a member of that than it is to be a member of, the SS in the 1930s, right? So what are you signing on to? I would say that we're given a lot of freedom. You have the story of Erastus, who was the city manager in Corinth, who, that's a position in the state. He was a co-missionary with Paul. He's praised by Paul in the scriptures and never criticized. When the tax collectors asked John the Baptist, what should we do? He didn't say stop being tax collectors. He said be honest tax collectors. So I think there is freedom there. Now, part of that might be, here's where you are now and here's what you can do versus the ideal, right? I think that's kind of if I'm an Anabaptist answering what I just said, I would say, well, yeah, that's where they were and they stay there, but ideally they wouldn't be in there at all. Okay. I'm not here to debate anything that there's a book that has 4 views on. I'm more saying, here's what is good about that question and that presupposition, and would say to the rest of the church, listen to what the Anabaptists have said, because you didn't listen to it and you kind of blew it. So that my personal view would be that you have a lot of freedom, that there's a lot of grace when it comes to which occupations, and that you go in there and you be honest and truthful. Now, that might mean you get your head cut off. If you're an honest person in a bad state, your life expectancy is probably kind of low. So you count the cost of that. I don't know if that answers the question or maybe.
Yes, no, it does. Thank you. That's very useful. I know we had talked about 30 minutes. I just had one other question that was coming from the students was, are you working on another book? And if so, can you give us a sneak peek of where that might take you?
Working on might be overstating it, but I have ongoing research agenda. By the way, I can do more. If you need to stop for you, that's fine, but I don't need to stop yet. There's material that I didn't get to in my research when the book was written, and some material that I'd researched that I just didn't have time given the book deadline. So maybe an expansion of this book, especially after the pandemic. One of the research agendas has been the degree. So, a lot of this book is about where is Jesus physically? Where is he geographically? What economy is he in when he's in Bethany, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Nazareth, Syrophoenicia with the Syrophoenician woman, right? So what is the economic base? I didn't say anything about the Syrophoenician woman, but since then I've done a lot of research. There's that whole conversation about you don't take the bread from the children and throw it to the dogs. And, so he's calling her a dog. So Jesus is mean. And she says, yes, but that there are crumbs that fall from the table that the dogs can eat. And there's all this argument is Jesus a meanie or is he not a meanie, or is he a meanie but we're supposed to be mean sometimes? And, because dog is bad. Well, okay. If you look at the archaeology and the economics, what you learn is that this woman's civilization was completely based on one economic good, largely based on the export of purple dye. And in the history and mythology of the Syrophoenician Empire, in fact, Phoenician actually means purple dye. There are civilizations named after the color of the dye that was their export. You look at coins at the time and writings by historians and mythological writings, that dye was discovered by a dog. And so the dog was out there going for a walk with a fisherman, or in some stories, it's a god, it's Hercules. And the dog finds a mollusk and he eats the mollusk, and he looks up and his snout is purple. And they realize that this mollusk can turn things purple, and they learn how to harvest the mollusk and make the dye. And then the dog is honored in their civilization, and the greatest animal graveyards of the ancient world are dog graveyards, in and around there. And they have coins, and on the back there's a coin of Hercules going for a walk and the dog eating the mollusk. So, we're all guessing what's Jesus doing with dogs, and is he being mean, and is he disrespecting her? It's fairly unlikely that she took dog comment as being disrespectful, given the fact that this culture seemed to really love dogs, and owed their economy to the accidental discovery of a dog. So there's stuff like that I learned after the book, or Jesus going into the plague zone of Capernaum and Bethsaida, where the plague was malaria. And so he's going into a plague zone. And so he's taking a risk going into a plague zone. But there are places that were much worse plague zones that he didn't go to. So he wasn't reckless, but he was risk tolerant. And maybe that speaks to art. And that's who he recruited from. He recruited from people from Bethsaida and Capernaum, people who lived in a plague zone, knew it was dangerous, took certain precautions. There were certain herbs and amulets that they took, but they went there anyway to make a living, but they weren't reckless enough to go to the places where the plague was 100% fatal. And that was that's who he recruited from, not safety first people, but people who had a certain risk tolerance. So there's a balancing between risk and opportunity, a pragmatic balancing that we see there that maybe is missing in our conversation, where you've got the safety only shamers and you've got the ostentatious risk takers for the sake of showing off faith. And Jesus dealt with a certain kind of person, risk tolerant but not stupid, and set up his headquarters there. So there's stuff like that I kept studying after the book was written that would probably be in a second edition of the book.
Those are great. Yeah. And the more I've been reading Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and what's it called? The Misreading Scripture Through Individualist Eyes, which also gives some of those background. The more I understand those background pieces as you laid out, and that's what I loved about your book, was highlighting the different cities. And like you mentioned, if we were to say Jesus went to Silicon Valley today, all of us in this space would know who he was talking to versus, whatever, Birmingham, Alabama or something. Like
Right.
that is so useful.
We know that. Right. If Jesus goes to Cana and there are water jars, oh, okay, there's water jars. Well, there's a whole thing about water jars, right? Because the Galileans weren't into economic exploitation, but they were into separation. And this is a little bit of a warning to the Anabaptists, that there was a strong emphasis on you can't deal with the pagans. You got to be separated from the pagans. And under Torah, stone water jars were not rendered as unclean as easily as, say, clay water jars, right? So there's a whole industry that's set up that's like a separation industry. This is to keep you separate from the unclean Gentiles. So that's background. That's an industry and a theological background, to that story, right? And so that was in Galilee. That was a big growth industry. This is their Christian t-shirts, Christian everything, John 3:16 ashtrays. We're gonna have a Christian separation for everything. Well, those stone jars were about that. The pagans don't make them filthy, unclean when they touch them. All right. So, but what's interesting is the water comes out, right? You read this in detail. When does the water turn to wine? It doesn't turn to wine in the water jar, because it says that the servants drew out water. But the architriklanon, the head of the feast, drank wine. It doesn't become wine till it gets out of its holiness separation zone. It's water when it's separated. It's wine when it's poured out. So there's an interplay here. And if you don't know the water, it's all over archaeology. There's plenty of archaeology about why are there all these stone water jars all of a sudden? Because they wanted to have commerce with the pagans, but they didn't want to be infected by the pagans' uncleanness, and stone stuff was one of the ways to deal with that. So those details really, place a lot. They're like an extra dimension of understanding, and they make Jesus really kind of come alive more than sort of the flat religion only reading.
And I think that's a really helpful piece. And one other question from students was, can you say a little bit more about how his economics got Jesus killed, and maybe why theologians have a problem with that?
We're told that when he tells the parable of the vineyard, where the vineyard stewards kill the messengers, the slaves, and then they kill the son so that they can inherit. We're told by Luke that the religious leaders discerned that he was talking about them and set out to destroy him. So that was a major target event for them. Also, Jesus's denunciations of the temple are pretty strong here. So, you know, you look at the story of the widow's mite, which is often used as a fundraising verse, which I think is incredibly dangerous. You know, in two of the synoptic gospels, the sequence of events is Jesus says, "You devour widows' houses." Then we have a story about a widow who for some reason thinks that she should be giving her last rent check away to the ministry. And then Jesus walks out of the temple in such a way that it triggers his disciples to ask him, that say, isn't this a beautiful temple? And he predicts the temple will be destroyed. So I think that, and then what is the charge against Jesus? You know, execution. The charge was blasphemy against the temple. It wasn't that he got some doctrinal issue wrong. It was blasphemy against the temple. Very problematic, because blasphemy is only against God. So how can you blaspheme against a temple unless you're worshiping it? So they're revealing their own idolatry. But let's keep in mind that, you know, Jerusalem was a company town and the company was the temple. So he was blaspheming the thing that was the major source of revenue for the ruling class. He was messing with the temple, and which he himself points out was a den of robbers, which we try to turn into something merely theological. They were robbers. I mean, Jesus knows what he was talking about. They were stealing from people. They had a false weights and measures thing going on with the temple shekel. So this thing between Jesus and this rivalry between Jesus and the temple is very much economic. And that's the talk about the temple is what becomes the charge. So it's clear to me that their motivation is that he was, putting an end. He was exposing the money train, they were all living off at the expense of everybody else.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So kind of as we wrap up, can you tell us if people want to follow you, if they want to know more about what you're doing? I noticed on your Wikipedia page, it talks about the Allegheny, I probably not pronouncing that right because I'm not from Pennsylvania, Allegheny Institute. Like, what are some things that you're doing if someone says, man, I really like to find out more? I know you do a podcast and a variety of things as well.
Yeah, the Institute's like 20 years ago. That was a think tank that I started. That was the stadium thing. We were a local economic think tank, and someone from local news came to us and said, hey, everyone's telling us that stadium taxes will be good for the economy. Are they? And we said, no, they aren't. They don't help. They make things worse. And for the next 2 years, we never had a moment's peace because, that was a hot issue. And no one else was willing to say that. So, I mean, I'm just easy to find on social media. Just remember the W, Bowyer. So, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, not TikTok. I'm over 50. I'm over 30, over 20. Nor Instagram. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but the kind of the standard ones, the ones that none of you follow anymore, but your parents do. I'm there, easy to find. I write on this topic for Christian Post business page fairly often. And I also write for world news groups that, World Magazine, their opinion page, but that's behind a firewall. So pretty much whenever I write anything, I put it out on social media. So that's the place to see it.
Great. Well, Jerry, thank you for your time today. This has been really, really great. And I've appreciated the questions from the students, very thoughtful, and just, hearing a bit more as we've just been able to discuss. I don't know, Stacy, if you had any other things to add.
No, I think this has been so helpful for this class is Bible and business. And so this has just been the perfect addition. And thank you so much.
My pleasure. Let me just make one other observation why I like groups like this. I think that young Christians have maybe gotten a little fed up with my generation's tendency to turn the volume down on Jesus. So there's a kind of sense that, wait a minute, Jesus is doing something socially here. And, dare I do generations, kind of boomer spirituality, is a little like, I don't know, where's that going to go? That scares me. And I think, millennial and Zoomers are much more attuned, much more open to a Jesus who is angry about exploitation. And so that's why I love groups like this, because there's not a blinder there that says, no, I'm not going to let Jesus talk about that. There's almost a frustration with, why won't my pastor talk about this, right? Or why won't my parents' generation, why won't they talk about this social stuff? Understandably, because, maybe they flirted with Marxism and they know how dangerous it is. And, when Jesus sounds a little Marxist, that's a little scary. But, don't be scared of Jesus. He's going to take you to the right place.
That's a great line to end. He will take you to don't be scared. It'll take you to the right place. Well, we're going to carry on for a little bit. We've got about another 20 minutes of class, but Jerry, thank you so much for your time, your generosity of giving it to us and sharing and answering questions. This has been great. Thank you.
It was a pleasure and an honor. God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Hey, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciated your questions. Didn't obviously have time to get all of them, and I tried to summarize some of the ones that were similar. So thank you for your engagement in that way. I want to make I'll just do that. We can talk about it tomorrow. We'll be all live together back in our separate groups. So if you have questions or thoughts, you want to just note them down, and we can talk about it in person tomorrow when we're all together back in the classroom. I want to make kind of a hard pivot and talk about technology for a couple of minutes before we wrap up today. And so just hang with me. We'll be, for those of you 8 o'clock people or 8:30 people, we'll be done around 10:15 at the latest. So, or 11:15, sorry, at the latest. So let me just pivot a little bit to talk about technology, and just to set up. So you've got some really great stuff. There's a Fast Company interview on technology for the future that you can watch, and I double checked it, and it is the correct. So for those where I've had to change those Fast Companies in the past, this is the right interview. And then we want you today, we've mentioned this a couple times throughout, we want you today, if you haven't, we want you to watch it anyway, even if you've seen it, to watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and just sort of unpack and have a look at the issues and the questions about that. And we can talk about that again tomorrow as well. Here's how I want to identify technology. So again, it's one of the eight trends. And here's how I want to, I do want to show you, here's how I want to unpack that. First of all, this is on the final stage of Canvas. These are the essential 8 things that I kind of keep referencing. So if you are working on your kind of thinking about the final, and you're thinking, what were those 8 things again? We haven't obviously talked about all of them, but this is right in Canvas. It's in the final days section, and it just pops up just like this. It's a little image. So technology or tech savvy is what the wording is. Here's the best definition for technology that I know of. Technology is something that was created after you were born. So think about this for a second. How many of you have ever thought about how a pen gets the ink inside? I never do. I mean, this is technology. Like, for the people that used to dip a quill into some ink and write on a piece of paper with like a little feather, something like this, if you were to go back to those days and say, here, buddy, use one of these, they would just be blown away. Like, how did this happen? How did you get this ink in here? How does this work? So we don't think about that. I don't ever think about that. I'm sure you don't think about that. but it is a technology. So for people like myself who are older, who can remember the first iPhone, and you heard me talk about this in that chapel talk, like it's a technology to me. For many of you who grew up with smartphones just around, maybe old, old ones and all the way through your life, it's not necessarily a technology. So people who see something as new and innovative, Uber or K tags on our cars, so we can just drive up to Kansas City and it just automatically does the toll, like those kind of things to me are all amazing technologies. Again, for those of you that's just how it is, then that's how you think about it. So what has happened is there's a guy named Mark Prensky, and he talks about two categories: digital natives and digital immigrants. And so someone like myself would be a digital immigrant, and a digital immigrant is someone who speaks with an accent. So when I use technology, it's not fluid, and it doesn't just flow like, again, for a digital native like yourself, technology is just interconnected with who you are. It's part and parcel of who you are. You've never had to learn how to use it. Like you just unconsciously activate, particularly like personal handheld devices and that kind of thing, right? But for someone who's a digital immigrant, they're able to use technology, but they see it as a gadget. So rather than just seeing it as something that's part of themselves, they see it as a gadget, something that they can grab and use and then put away, or, ooh, it's this cool little trick that I can use my smart speaker here in the house. Like, ooh, it's this cool gadget. But for people growing up that had one of those in their house, it's like, it's just what it is. And so into that, a digital immigrant, technology isn't integrated into their lifestyle. I can't tell you the last time I took a picture with my phone. I can't even remember. I know I have a few pictures, but it's just not part of my lifestyle, where I would assume that you've taken, I don't know, how many photos already this morning, right? Like for Snapchat or whatever, like you're just snapping all the time. So for me, it's an immigrant person. It's not integrated into who I am in my life. And I'm not saying that makes me better. Please don't hear that. This isn't a value judgment of like, ooh, look at me, I'm better because I don't have this all integrated. That's not the point. The point is, though, it's a gadget and it's something I have to think about using versus just using. And so an immigrant is someone in those kind of categories. A digital native is just constantly using those things. A couple things as well about digital natives, and you could test this on yourself. Digital natives are never more than 9 feet away from their devices. So try this sometime. Put your phone in another room and then like walk away and intend to be gone for a while and not have a watch on. So it's not like beeping you on your watch. Does that make you like a little bit nervous? Because they've done studies and apparently that's what happens. And the same way too, digital natives, are continually upgrading, always wanting the new and the next. And again, that doesn't mean it's just part and parcel. It's how it works. So here's a question I want you to think about and put an answer in the chat. How do you think continuous updates affect you or shape you as a consumer? So how do continuous updates of whatever it is, whether it's my smart speaker, my laptop, my phone, technology, the smart tag in my car, I'm not necessarily talking about phones or anything, but how does continuous updates shape you as a consumer in the world? Take a minute. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Casey, for jumping in. Yeah, just type it into the chat. Great. I know it takes a little while for people to type, so we'll give you some space. There we go. They're all firing in now. there's a benefit, right? As you're typing, there's a like benefit or desire I think we all have to have the latest. I woke up this morning, my phone needs to do an update. Apparently, there must be a new iOS. So we want those things because there's always new features or they fix some problems. I noticed some of you talking about that. It keeps you engaged in that way, but also then there's new parts to apps too, right? Like maybe that's how you were thinking about it, like new filters or new ways to share or new this or that, right? Like, so it may not be the hardware that's updating, like I mentioned about my phone. It may be something that's also seeking to update. And one of the things that you'll see in the social dilemma is to answer the question. I won't have you type it in the chat, but what are the dangers? And I came across this quote, and I'm sorry, I can't remember where I saw it. But I came across this quote, and I just want to pop it up here, that I think is such an interesting way of thinking about technology. Just read this for a second. I won't read it to you because I know you can read. I think I saw this in another book where somebody quoted this Jeremy Glass. I don't know much or anything about him, but it seems to me this really summarizes one of the dangers, not all, or some. The life spontaneity, if we can't take off without our phones, if we can't take off, and there's no signal or whatever, then it didn't happen. There's an interesting kind of effect, right, that happens in our lives when we're so tied to something. And so again, that could be the K tag on my car. Like he obviously is talking about phones, but it doesn't have to be that kind of thing as well. As you look at and engage the material today, I want to just encourage you to think about how inundated we are with technology. I love or thinking about like one way to frame like what's coming, and I could talk about this kind of stuff all day, but I won't. It's because we're getting close on time. But the one way to frame all this is to think about the letters grain. So GRAIN. So here are some of the things that I haven't even mentioned yet that are coming in, we are living in the midst of as we think about it. So genetic engineering is the first one, G. Genetic engineering, I mean, think about that with crops and different things. Robotics is the R. That again, we're all living in. AI, we've talked about that briefly in class. AI is another part of this. Informational technology, big data, gathering data, assessing data, using data, and then nanotechnology. So those would be the grain, GRAIN, genetic engineering, robotics, AI, informational technology, and nanotechnology. There's all kinds of things moving forward that we need to know about for business, but just in general in life. And yeah, I know I talked about some of those in that video that you've watched as well. So I'll let you look those up yourself. I wanted to look at one last story, or one story today, from the story of Jesus, and just reframe it in this context of technology, and think about that. And then I think both Stacey, we want to give you some just sort of instructions as we go through. I mean, we're getting really close to the end. So there's some things I want you to know and to be aware of and be thinking about as we wrap up. But we will be all together tomorrow. But let me read you a story. I'm going to read it the way it's written in the Bible, and then I'm going to read it again and change some words. And I promise I won't get struck with lightning by God for doing that, just to make a point. Okay. So here's a story. It comes from right at the beginning of the book of Mark. And I told you on the very first day that the way Mark wrote is like action, 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 action. So lots of things happening one right after the other. But so Jesus has just healed a ton of people. He's done all kinds of incredible things. This is in the Galilee region, to use Jerry's kind of mapping. And it says this: very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions, Simon's also known as Peter, Simon and his companions went looking for him. And when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone's looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That's why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. So let me just change a couple words and see how this might kind of maybe more apply. And I think one of you asked in the chat, how would these stories apply if Jesus was living here today? In fact, that was one of the questions. I know I saw that. So let me read it a little bit differently. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, completely unplugged, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, away from the signals, and where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Jesus, you're trending. Everyone is looking for you." And Jesus replied, "Let's switch platforms, and let's go somewhere else, to nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That's why I've come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. I love kind of reframing the story in this way, because it's like Jesus had so much pressure, so many things going on, and he leaves it. He just walks away. And he's at the height of his popularity. Like crowds, huge crowds are coming. And he says, "Nah, let's just walk away. Let's go do something different. Let's go to another group of people. Like these have had enough. So we'll switch from, we'll drop off Twitter. Now we'll go post on Instagram for a while. And then when the followers get huge, we'll just stop doing that and we'll go somewhere else." His point was he wanted to connect with people. His point wasn't to develop this huge, giant following. And so by taking care of himself, he's wanting to get away and do his own thing and be on his own and connect with God through prayer. And that leads me right into what I want to talk about, particularly if regarding the shape paper. So we mentioned this, I don't know, way toward the beginning, not the first day, but just want to emphasize how important it is to think about and to take some time. Like the shape paper has a very clear set of instructions. And if you follow those, you'll do fine. The paper will be brilliant. It'll be great. If you don't follow those instructions, that's where you're going to, points are going to get lost and it's just not going to work. So follow those instructions to the letter and it'll be golden. You'll be fine. And one of the parts of that, though, is going away by yourself and taking some time to reflect and to think and just to think about your life. If you want to pray, awesome, that'd be great, but that's not necessarily required. It's just to go away and kind of reflect on everything we've been talking about in this class. And the shape papers due this weekend. So today's Wednesday, so you have Thursday, Friday, and then into the weekend. Actually, I think it's due on Friday. I'll give you some grace. I'll give you some grace over the weekend. But it's something that you need to be taking some time and just taking that. And then the second part, which also takes more time, is remembering that you're connecting with at least, I think it's 2, I don't have it in front of me, the instructions. It's 2 or maybe 3 people that you're actually then sharing with and getting their feedback. Read the instructions, don't take what I just said. I know it's at least 2, it may be 3. And you're getting some response and some feedback from others on what you've written and how they view you and what your life is like. It can be, and I hope it is, it's really, really encouraging for you. So you can't do it if you wait till the last minute. I think that was all I wanted to say about shape. Stacy, is there anything? I did want to just also talk about the article for tomorrow, but anything else? Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is just One of the posts, so there's watching the Fast Company video. There's also the Netflix. There's a short quiz where you're basically just filling in, how, yeah, I'll leave it, how the technology conversation. And then there's an article that we will discuss tomorrow on change. John Cotter is written tons of stuff on change management, change theory. And so we'll be talking about change as part of our conversation tomorrow when we're back in class. So read that article, make a few notes, have some questions that we can discuss tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you, 8:30 group, for coming on later. Thank you for you all connecting, having your cameras, connecting with us. And thanks for the comments and the questions. That's really helpful. If anybody wants to say anything, yeah, just unmute, and otherwise. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day. We're available if you want to email or contact us.